Welcome to your lesson on A Tale of Two Fractions. Part 1. Part 2 you will complete on your own. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. Two fractions wanted to combine, but they did not have a common denominator. Would this be a problem? Yes! Well, sometimes. Could it be overcome? Of course, all good stories have a happy ending. Meet the fractions, 1/2 and 3/5. They will need a common denominator when we add or subtract them. They will not need a common denominator when we multiply or divide them, so let's start with multiplication. So for our first example, we're going to do 1/2 times 3/5. So essentially really easy. You just multiply across the top, multiply across the bottom. So you're going to have 1 times 3 over 2 times 5, and so you're going to end up with 3/10. It doesn't need to be reduced, so we're good to go. Now, let's divide. We have 1/2 divided by 3/5, so do you remember what you need to do here? Yeah, you're right. You need to flip that second fraction and multiply. So we're going to rewrite it as 1/2 times 5/3, and then we're going to do just like we did on the last problem. We're going to multiply across the top and across the bottom. So we're going to do 1 times 5 over 2 times 3, and that's going to give us 5/6. Again, no need to simplify this any further. It can't be reduced. So let's move on to addition. Now remember, we waited on addition and subtraction till now because they require a common denominator. So first thing we're going to do is figure out the least common denominator. So to get the least common denominator, you look at the two denominators, and you want to keep this as simple as possible. So first, write down the first denominator, so 2, and then you're going to do times, and then you're going to include any factor in the second denominator that's not in the first. So 5 is relatively prime to 2. The only thing they have in common is 1, so we're going to have to do 2 times 5, and so we get 10. All right. So now that we know that our common denominator is 10, we need to convert both fractions to a form that has the same value. So the first one's going to need to have a value of 1/2, and the second one's going to need to have a value of 3/5, but that has a 10 in the denominator. So you look at the 1/2, and you compare it with your least common denominator, and you go, okay, it's got the factor of 2, it needs the factor of 5. So you're going to multiply it by 5 on the bottom to get your common denominator of 10. Now, you're also going to multiply by 5 on top because remember, we don't want to change the value, we just want to change the form. So the big result is that we're just multiplying by a fancy form of 1, 5 over 5. Okay, now to 3/5, we've got the factor of 5, we need the factor of 2. So we're going to multiply on bottom by 2 to give us a 10, but if we do that to the bottom, we have to do it to the top because we're just changing the form and not the value. So we need to multiply essentially by a form of 1. All right, so now we've got two little multiplication problems. We're going to go ahead and do them, and then we'll add. So 1 times 5 is 5, 2 times 5 is 10, 3 times 2 is 6, 5 times 2 is 10. So we've got 5/10 plus 6/10. Now, we have a common denominator of 10, so we just use that, and then we add the numerators together. So we do 5 plus 6 is 11 over 10. Okay, we just use the common denominator. Now, this is an improper fraction. 11/10 is the same thing as 1 and 1/10. You do not need to switch it to a mixed number. It can't be reduced, so we can leave it just like it is. All right, now we're going to subtract. So we're going to do 3/5 minus 1/2. Again, in addition and subtraction, you have to have a common denominator. You have to be combining the same size of pieces. Okay, the denominator tells you the size of the piece, the numerator tells you how many pieces. So our least common denominator again is going to be 5 times 2, or 10, and so we've got to rewrite our fractions with the common denominator of 10. And I know some of you can do this in your head, but we're going to be doing this for algebraic expressions pretty soon, and so just kind of indulge me and write through the steps because it's going to make what we do with algebraic expressions easier in just a few lessons. Okay, so we've got 3 over 5. We need a 10 on the bottom. The the denominator does not have a factor of 2, so we're going to multiply by 2 on the bottom. Got to do it on top as well because that's just a fancy form of 1. Minus 1/2 times 5 over 5. Again, the reason for that is that 1/2 has the 2, it needs the 5. So we're going to multiply on bottom and top by the 5. And so we're going to have 6/10 minus 5/10. So we use the common denominator of 10 and we actually combine the numerators. So 6 minus 5 is 1, and so we end up with 1/10. Well, what if the answer does need to be simplified, like 9/12? So far we haven't had to reduce anything or simplify it. Well, remember what you do is you consider the factors of the 9 and the factors of the 12. You go, okay, 9 is 3 times 3, 12 is 3 times 4, and so we cancel the common factors. Okay, so we're going to reduce by a factor of 3, and we end up with 3/4. Again, this is something that many of you can do in your head, but if you can't, that's fine. And if you would, even if you can do it in your head, please at least think through this process because we are going to be doing this algebraically pretty soon, and it's going to be helpful if you've kind of thought through the whole process. Okay, guys, that's it from my part of Tale of Two Fractions. Tale of Two Fractions Part 2 is your part. Next class period, you will have 2 options. You can complete a short review and take a quiz on fractions. Okay, just kind of a standard classroom assessment kind of activity. This is just to warm up our brains for math for this year and just to review the fractions with numbers because like I said, we're going to be doing an algebra review here very first thing this semester, and if you understand the arithmetic of fractions, it makes the algebra the algebra forms of fractions easier to work with. Now, let's say you don't want to do that. Say you want to do something more creative. Well, you can create a short children's book called A Tale of Two Fractions in which you will multiply, divide, add, and subtract 2 randomly assigned fractions. So I'm going to have a bunch of fractions and you're going to draw for 2 of them, and that will be your pair of fractions, and I'll write it down and keep track of it, and that way no 2 people are going to have the exact same book, because everybody will have a different pair of fractions. So it's up to you. Don't worry if you're not a great artist. You can do stick figures, but it will need to be a little children's book. So kind of be thinking about that if that's what you want to do. Okay, guys, that's it for this first video. I'm excited to see what y'all choose to do next time and how you do. Have a good day.